net neutrality. Net neutrality is something that is essential for small businesses, for consumers. It's essential to keep the freedom associated with the internet alive. The idea of throttling certain sites or charging extra for certain services just does not make sense. And if we are going to continue to ensure that technology, and particularly digital technology and the use of the internet, is the lever to create economic growth and opportunities for citizens right across this country, we need to continue to defend net neutrality, and I will.
What does that defense actually mean? What does that defense actually mean? Will you speak with the president? Do you have any message?
Like many people, we are just absorbing the position that the president has taken, and looking at the impacts it's going to have in the United States and in Canada. But I know there are an awful lot of people concerned about this, and you can count me as one of them.
Mr. Prime Minister, unless my teeth are chattering too much, I'm pretty sure I didn't hear Minister Milczyn actually commit any more money. I understand that this plan counts on about half of the money coming from the provinces. Is that not a measure of how much work still needs to be done and to make this happen?
On the contrary, what we have heard from our provincial partners here in Ontario and across the country, our municipal partners, is a level of excitement and a level of commitment to getting this done. Obviously, there's always some fine-tuning and continued work to be done to make sure that the money flows in the right way at the right times, but we are confident that both the will and the resources are there to make this national housing strategy a reality and to have a real solid impact on people right across the country.
Just to follow up on the commitment to half chronic homelessness, Ontario says they can get rid of it completely. We've heard governments promise things like that for decades, and the situation on Toronto streets now, particularly this winter, actually looks worse than I've seen it in several years. What can you tell us about what will the government actually do to actually solve what is an immensely complicated problem?
This is a problem that has seemed intractable for far too long. We know that there are many strategies, many investments that can and must be made in order to combat homelessness. It's a very different challenge in Indigenous communities than in urban centres. It's a different impact in rural areas. There's differences in how people deal with it in domestic violence situation and others. We know that we need a serious and meaningful strategy to move forward, and with that I'd actually like and we are committed to that, and on that I want to turn to my friend Adam Vaughan, who has made this part of his life's calling, and he and I had a great conversation on the way over here, and I certainly want him to weigh in on the approach on homelessness. And I want to give him this opportunity to speak.
Fundamentally, if you're going to end homelessness, you need housing first to work. And for housing first to work, you need housing first. And so part of the strategy is building a comprehensive systemic response right across the country by getting the new public housing, the new social housing, affordable housing and supportive housing built so we can transition people who are chronic or episodically or living in very, very vulnerable situations into stronger, better housing with the supports they need. That reprofiling of the Homeless Partnership money is underway right now. We've been in listening exercises and roundtables across the country over the summer and into the fall. Just came back from Calgary, and we are looking at it from a preventive perspective, but also from a permanence perspective. But the reality is for us to have a national housing strategy, for us to respect people's fundamental human rights, we have got to use housing as the most important tool to realize that. And so we are committed to reducing it. And I'm glad that Ontario is pushing us harder. I'm glad that cities are pushing us harder. But you know who's pushing the hardest? The people with lived experience. And those people have the expertise and the perspective to lead us to a better tomorrow. And with government resources now in play, that better tomorrow is not just down the street and around the corner. It's here, it's present in this community, and will continue to grow towards a more successful systemic response.
Hi, Mr. Prime Minister. Peter Goffin, Canadian Press. I want to congratulate you on getting to hold the Grey Cup yesterday. But I also wanted to ask, do you think the Edmonton Eskimos should change their name out of respect to Canada's Inuit population?
Obviously, that's a part of reconciliation is listening to concerns and understanding what habits of the past need to change. This is a discussion and a reflection that the City of Edmonton certainly needs to undertake. Reconciliation is not just about Indigenous people and the government. It's about all of us as Canadians, non-Indigenous as well. And I think that's a really important discussion to have.
Hi, Pam Seidel from City News. Hello, Mr. Prime Minister. I know you said, I think your words were you didn't want to get into the weeds, but I'm going to press you for a few specifics. We had heard speculation that it would be 100,000 new units, 300,000 repairs to existing units. Can you be a little bit more specific about that? And one other thing is we expected you to outline details about the $11.2 million that was announced in the budget in March. Now it's up to $40 billion. Could you explain that too, please?
Absolutely. There was a technical briefing earlier, and there's handouts with all the exact details. But the $40 billion includes money that is being repurposed, includes loans, includes a large basket of things that will directly impact on housing. Further to that, we have more announcements to make. People will have noticed that the national housing strategy we've talked about today does not really include the place where the needs are greatest across this country in Indigenous communities. And that is because our focus cannot be that Ottawa will determine what the needs and what the path forward is in Indigenous communities. We are going to work with Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities, as well as the urban Aboriginal population, to ensure that we are creating, in time for next spring, a housing strategy that addresses their needs. But for more specifics, I'm going to turn again to Adam Vaughan, who has been carrying this along with Jean-Yves in its details for weeks and months, and connecting with all the great advocates around here to make sure that we're doing it right. So some of the numbers, Adam?
Sure. So currently there are about 385,000 Canadians that are living in government or publicly supported housing, co-ops to public housing to community-based providers. Those operating agreements will be renewed and protected and put onto a 10-year time cycle so that we no longer see the practice of the previous government, which by stealth allowed operating agreements to expire and people literally lose the income support they needed to stay in their homes. So 385,000 operating agreements will be renewed, including co-ops, and that's really important. Co-ops are good. The second thing is that we're going to have a repair program that will target about 30,000 units. Older units in communities like this will be supported through revitalization programs. The portable housing benefit will play a critical role in that because you can move people around while you fix units and move people back, and zero displacement is a fundamental principle here in Lawrence Heights, as it is in Alex Park. This policy supports that. The other issue is around the construction of new units. 100,000 are expected under this program, and those new units will be cost shared by the province and the federal government. And then again, the most important part of this, which is around dealing with, from my perspective, which is dealing with Indigenous homelessness and Indigenous housing needs across this country. That's the next chapter. That's an additional conversation that's happening. The tables are already underway with the Métis Nation, First Nations, Inuit peoples, but we also have to focus on urban Aboriginal populations, which sometimes are multinational in composition, sometimes non-status. If we can solve that issue in this generation, reconciliation will be achieved with the housing strategy. When those dollars are announced and attached to the $40 billion, we have the ability, I think, to make a real dent in all housing needs right across the country. The $40 billion breaks down very quickly into $4.8 billion, which is base funding. We doubled that when we took office immediately to show that we were serious about housing. We announced $11.2 billion in the last budget. Much of that is going into the new Canadian housing benefit. There's an additional $10.9 billion, which is below market mortgages and loans, and that's going to support, in particular, co-ops, but also financing and transformation of housing projects. There's additional dollars already committed to the Indigenous stream that's close to $5 billion. And then if you add some additional dollars that come from other funding streams, and this is where the province of Ontario has really stepped up on the health accord. When we invested heavily heavily into mental health issues and support, in particular for young people with mental health issues. The Ontario government insisted on place-based supports to put treatment in sight and in communities. And that additional dollars that they forced us to spend, and I'll say happily spend, that is going to provide even more housing support for some of the most vulnerable Canadians, youth with mental health challenges. And when you put all of that together, it totals up to $40 billion. The background notes detail it. We doubled the homeless partnership strategy dollars the first budget we were in office. That effective doubling has extended services right across the country. We're now looking at how do we extend to more communities that are targeted for specific programs. We're also looking at the North. The Northwest Territories in particular has some significant challenges that have to be addressed, and we're sitting down with the Housing Minister, with Indigenous leaders, but also housing providers and frontline people with lived experience to show us how to make that better. So we have acted already on that. We're reprofiling that money for a couple of other reasons. Youth. We have a national challenge which scares people when they look at it, but in some provinces, Manitoba, there are almost 12,000 kids in foster care. Foster care is great when it works, but when it doesn't, it becomes a superhighway to homelessness. The previous government designed a program that put the most vulnerable youth in our country on city streets for 6 months before they'd even talk about helping them. Think about that in a day like today. You take 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids who are aging out of care, and you don't even talk to them about housing until they're 6 months on the street. That has put them in the most vulnerable situations you can possibly imagine. Many of them out west and in rural communities are Indigenous. It's one of the reasons we have such horrific numbers in terms of disappeared and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That program has got to end as quickly as possible. We're doing the work now and making sure that happens, and working with community groups, people with experience to get there. So we've acted on homelessness quickly. There's more work to be done, but if you don't put it into a national strategy and wrap it with supports that focus on people's needs, you don't get the job done. And one of the great things about the portable housing benefit is the way it will now work with the national housing strategy around homelessness and around the homeless partnership strategy, and create a continuum of care that wraps around a person and recognizes their human rights to housing and gets them the work and the support they need.
Is that it? Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. I had another long answer to give, but I'm good. We're done. Thank you, sir.